But let's talk about what are the advantages of pre-header bidding. Maybe Tom, you take
Well, I mean, I think every publisher should be looking at pre-header bidding and frankly should be doing it. I mean, what we've seen with the publishers that we see doing it, something like 25 to 30% of the top 1,000 domains are doing it now, and they're seeing significant and sustained revenue lift from it. And there's a couple of obvious reasons for that. I mean, number one, they're getting the bids in up front, so they're actually able to see the bids before they start making decisions about the rest of the ad. Number two, it's actually pretty easy to do, so it's a relatively easy way to start generating some incremental revenue. And number three, it gives the buyers actually the opportunity to see more of your inventory and pay more for more of the stuff that they want. So, we see it as a pretty positive thing all the way around.
So it's interesting in a day where we spent the morning talking about consumer experience and latency that we're having a discussion about adding an additional piece of JavaScript that makes additional HTTP calls to every page. I think that the real question around this kind of strategy is what are the long-term effects? And there really has not been a neutral study of the latency effect of adding this to the page, especially on mobile devices and on cellular networks, which we all know is the future of all of our businesses. There are also some interesting questions about what it does to the publisher and advertiser market dynamics. In the exchange model today, there's enforcement of pricing. If someone is an exchange bidder, the exchanges are responsible for making sure that person pays what they say they're going to pay based on the results of the auction. Introducing this new sort of per query pricing into the primary ad server, there's currently no mechanism for being sure that if someone uses the API to report that they want to pay $4, that they actually paid $4 down the line, and figuring that out is something that the industry would have to solve for. The other thing that's an interesting question is what does this do about advertiser behavior? It's not clear how much demand and yield comes from shopping the same query from the same user to the same bidder multiple times using different systems. And all of the buyers I've talked to are aware that this is going on, and they don't feel like they have a lot of data to figure out if that's good or bad for them. Should they be preferring one exchange versus another for their queries? Is there an ROI hit based on what sequence they're seeing things? So if this started to become more prevalent, there's a question of whether buyers might respond like we've seen them respond with everything else in the industry by asking for more transparency and accountability. If you look at the trustworthy supply chain or viewability, you could end up in a world where the buyers want a unique per query identifier to be passed throughout the system so they can say, hey, am I actually getting the same user shopped around as opposed to some system adding actual ROI value?
So now that we've covered the positives, let's talk about the negatives.
Yeah, so you guys have brought up some good points here, but I want to, for the folks in the room, I want to simplify it a little bit and talk about, you talked about increased revenue.
Yeah.
From a publisher, I'm ready to listen. So,
sure.
So can you go back and tell me, what's the uptick that you've been seeing? Is it,
Yeah, no, it's pretty significant. So imagine for a moment that in a typical platform, you've got a retargeter who may want to buy only 5% of your inventory, but they're willing to pay a lot for it because those are the retargeters that they're really going after. If you're only showing them like 30% of your inventory after all your direct sales, then the most they could possibly buy if they want 5% of that is 5% of 30%, which is like 1.5%. It's kind of the most they'll ever buy from you, right? But if you show them 100% of your inventory in the header, then the most they could buy from you is actually 5%. And even if they only end up buying 3%, let's say, it's still twice as much as what they would have bought before. So structurally, it's good for you as a publisher because you're selling a lot more to that retargeter at high CPMs. It's good for them, too, because they're actually seeing more of the inventory that they want. So it's good for their customers as well. So, and I can't let the latency thing go by, I have to say, because honestly, one way or another, you have to call that retargeter and wait some number of milliseconds for them to respond. So you can either do that in the header and wait some number of milliseconds and then pass that into your primary ad server, or you can wait till the primary ad server does some work and then he calls the retargeter and waits probably the same amount of time and then comes back. So the latency thing in terms of actual ad delivery, and if it's properly implemented, it doesn't have any impact on the page delivery, I think that's kind of a red herring.
I think you've got some really interesting points in there, and I'll probably talk about latency, and then you raise a really good point that people should be doing related to first looks. So we do have some common ground, Tom.
Good, excellent.
We both agree you're very tall.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think with latency, this is where what I would really love to see is some neutral party actually doing some analysis on latency, whether it's a publisher or the IAB or a group of publishers getting together with revenue. Because obviously Tom is going to come here and tell you how everything is great. I'm going to come here and tell you how everything is terrible. You probably shouldn't trust either of us on that. I think what is interesting is when you talk about adding extra latency, I was struck, there was an article recently about, I think it was a woman from Edmunds writing about how do you get all of your yield together. And I think as we know, when you talk about RTB, the time to respond is 100 milliseconds, plus or minus, and there's a lot of rigor that the industry has put into that. And this article from Edmunds, I haven't had a chance to talk to the author, was mentioning, well, you should make sure that your header bids come back within the standard 500 milliseconds. So there is something about how much can you do in parallel with the existing RTB call out versus adding something additional up front. But where I do agree with you is there's a huge amount of revenue opportunity around opening up a true first look to remarketers. And this can be pretty nerve-wracking because it actually means going even above your reservations and your sponsorships, because ultimately you're dealing with such a small percentage of your total audience. You can do that in a way that doesn't put your reservations or your sponsorships at risk. We just think the right way to do that is using the server-to-server programmatic pipes that work so well today. So we've actually got a beta product right now of opening up a first look auction. And what we also think is good with that is you're not limited to saying, well, I can only support 1 or 3 or 5 preferred vendors to do that. You can have the same advantage that you do of RTB today, is that you can have everybody competing. You can have Criteo compete, AppNexus compete, Amazon compete. Anybody who is able to bid RTB and has a remarketing business could be bidding there, so you can capture exactly what you said of the increased reach of competition up there without having to add more JavaScript and more tags.